So the next thing we're going to do is bring a panel to the stage, and I'm going to introduce them as OpenUK people, because in a minute they're going to tell you who they really are. So can I invite Dr. Dawn Foster, who's a member of the OpenUK board, Liz Rice, who's also a member of the OpenUK board. I feel like I'm going to give you a prize and I don't have anything for you, sorry. Matt Barker, who is our entrepreneur in residence, and Dr. Rebecca Taylor, who is one of our partners. I was really smiling through that video because I agree with what it says, but also because some of the people in the video are in the audience, and it was quite funny to watch them because I hate watching myself on screen. But I could see one or two people sitting nodding and thinking, yeah, I was right when I said that. And it's good to see that they still have the same commitment. So I'm very quickly going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, starting with Dawn, and a little bit about who they are, what they do, and how their open source career has developed from the UK.
Yeah, so I'm Dawn Foster. I've been working in open source for well over 20 years from companies like Intel and VMware. I'm currently the director of data science for the Chaos Project, which is an open source project focused on measuring project health for open source projects. I'm also, as Amanda mentioned, on the board of OpenUK, and I am the co-chair of the CNCF Contributor Strategy Technical Advisory Group, and I've been here in the UK. I came here to get a PhD, which I did, and then just stayed, and so I've been here for almost 10 years, and I live just north of London in Hertfordshire.
Thank you, Liz. Hi, yeah, I'm Liz Rice. I am Chief Open Source Officer of a company called Isovalent that is really, I think, quite a good example of a company that built a successful business model around open source technology and recently got acquired by Cisco. So we're going through that assimilation process, but it's going very well so far. I've been involved in open source probably about 12 years. I've been in software kind of all my career. So I've seen that kind of proprietary and open source contrast. As well as being involved with OpenUK, I'm also very involved with the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Yeah, that's me. Matt.
Hey everybody, I'm Matt Barker. Excuse me. I'm entrepreneur in residence for OpenUK, but listening to Will speak, I've lived the entire ups and downs of starting a company around open source in the UK. Set up a company 10 years ago, purpose-driven to try and change the world with Kubernetes. Created an open source project around that, which has grown on to become the de facto way of doing certificate management in Kubernetes. I tried to get funding in the UK. No one understood what I was talking about, so decided to bootstrap it instead. I saw the impact of Brexit and ability to hire off the back of that. I then sold out to the US because I thought my options of owning stock in a US company would be better than in the UK. I then got bought by Thoma Bravo, which ironically is the company that just took Darktrace private from London Stock Exchange, and we've just been bought by a public company called CyberArk, which is based on the NASDAQ. So I've got lots of friends who are right now looking at trying to start businesses again, and I've got lots of issues with where we are in the UK, and hopefully we'll be working together to try and change some of that and improve the situation.
And Rebecca, you're the outlier in this group. Tell us about yourself.
Okay, I'm Rebecca Taylor. I'm an associate professor at the University of Southampton. I'm a social scientist, but I work quite closely with colleagues in computer science and web science, which we have a big web science institute at Southampton. I kind of enjoy cross-disciplinary working, although it's very challenging. You do a lot of translation, different languages being spoken across disciplines. So my involvement with open source goes back a few years. I'm a sociologist of work and organisations, and I've spent a lot of my research career looking at unpaid work and thinking about different ways of working, particularly, and futures of work. And the unpaid work thing, I've looked at volunteering and I've looked at internships. I've looked a lot at the creative industries where there's a lot of unpaid work going on. And I ended up, perhaps unsurprisingly, finding open source labour and open source contributions and that kind of the communities that are built up around open source software as a really interesting place to look at unpaid work. But in that process of doing research on open source communities and open source work, I've kind of expanded my interest, and I'm quite interested in the whole the whole policy dimension of it, and also the public sector element. I've just done a study, which I'll come back to at some point, about public sector involvement in open source. So that's me.
Thank you. And you met one of my friends at another OpenUK event, and he was very pleased about the fact that you'd said to him that he was what you were researching. And the open source community, as a maintainer, he felt very recognized and seen, which doesn't always happen in our submarine. So talking about that submarine, you particularly, Liz, Dawn and Matt, live in your submarine, whether you're aware of it day to day or not, and there's no need to sing.
Yellow.
But you're in this submarine under the UK's digital economy as part of the open source business community, people who are paid, whether it's from a UK company or an international company, to do open source related jobs. Can you tell us a bit about your skills journey? I'm going to start with Liz. How did you get into open source? How has that evolved for you, and how has that open source contribution built your career?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I started in proprietary software, and it was really only when I was actually sort of working on my first startup that we were using open source components, using some open source libraries. I wanted to start, fixing problems that I could see in the code, and it was a gradual realization that, there's this really, it's not just that it's free, this is really good technology, and that I can make changes to it very quickly and effectively because of the way open source works. And kind of a couple of startups later, I was then really focusing on containers and cloud computing, cloud native computing, where basically all that infrastructure code is open source for good reason, because it's really, how you can innovate, because it's a great way for people to standardize by, rather than sitting in a room creating, official standards, more de facto standards by people using things that work and kind of gradually accreting around a particular approach. So things like containers, things like Kubernetes, nobody sort of stood up and proclaimed that this should be the way we do things. It was the actions of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people liking that technology, contributing to that technology, recognizing how well it works, and now it's the underpinning of the way that companies, large and small, all put their software in the cloud.
And you personally, though, Liz?
Yeah, and I guess because I was involved in that technology, and not just in the code side, but also talking about our experiences, I think this is one of the things that's really powerful in the way open source works. We don't just sort of sit in a dark room and write code. We also go out and share our experiences and talk about what we've done. And I think for me personally, doing kind of educational talks, showing the world what I was working on and what I was excited about, really helped me get more visible personally. And that really, it increased my value as an employee, as someone that people maybe wanted to have on their team. And I think that's true of many, many people. You could really see the work they're doing. I think, it came up in the video. You can look at the work that somebody's doing, see what they've done, not just in code, but the way they communicate, the way they interact with other people, and you can see their value, and that makes people attractive to potential employers internationally. And that's certainly been the case for me. I've been really lucky to work for Israeli companies. Isovalent was a kind of US-Swiss company. Now I'm working for a multinational. And all those things are only really possible through open source.
So that visible living CV that could be seen by employers all over Europe, all over the world, enabling you to develop a career, to engage and find roles in companies in other countries through open source. And I think, Liz, you just won something for the top contribution to AWS in the UK, which to me is tremendous, and we celebrated in OpenUK. But then when we look at something like Tech Week, you are not listed as one of their top speakers. If we went to the Bay Area, you would rock a stage as a keynote speaker, and we know you do that regularly. And there's this disconnect currently between the UK's understanding of its population and this population that Rebecca was talking about, who are home working, who are contributing initially for free. Matt, you started back in the day with me at Canonical, but how has it evolved?
Yeah, so I got into it completely by chance. There weren't many, I guess, really interesting tech companies in the UK at the time, but Mark Shuttleworth, who many of you may know for founding Thought and Going to Space, created an open source company that actually did certificate management. It was a CA. And he was starting his new company, which was a Linux operating system. I knew nothing about tech. I'm pretty sure that in my first meeting I asked what a server was. It was that bad. But I kind of wanted to be with someone who'd done it before, had succeeded, and sort of see what they were up to and what they were doing. And very quickly I realized that open source was like the foundation of so much of the technology that we used, whereas no one knew about it. So I didn't even know Firefox was open source at the time. I just used it as a browser. I was like, hang on, that's open source? And then I learned that the New York Stock Exchange was built on Linux. And then I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And then I realized the internet was founded on open source. And then all of a sudden, an Android phone came out. I was like, well, that's based on open source as well. That's Linux. And then the public cloud. And I was working with Amazon early doors, and they were using all open source technology to build that. And then now it powers the foundation of all of our AI. In fact, it powers Kubernetes and containers and cloud native. Pretty much everything is open source. And I think when you get a chance to work on something that has such a big impact, and you can engage in it, and you can contribute in it, and you can learn together, and it's a driver for innovation, like that's not much of a better place to be, in my opinion. So I think I think it's become much more important. I think that the thing that's a little sad to me is that maybe in the UK we don't really recognize it or understand it in the same ways that other people in other countries do. And I think that's why I'm so grateful for the OpenUK and what you do to try and sort of bring that message and try and help people engage around it and learn from it.
I would almost challenge the last thing you said there about other countries recognising it better. No, not about OpenUK. Thank you for that. No, about other countries recognising it better. I'm not sure if they do.
Maybe they don't.
I think we've got slightly different models. I'm not sure that locally, if we spoke to people at grassroots, if you spoke to Isovalent's founder, if they would say Switzerland were better. You know, I think it's a universal if you're outside of the Bay Area.
Maybe not, but then I guess all of the big early adopters that I saw of open source in government were Germany, France.
Yeah, in government's different.
Like we were miles behind,
Yeah.
and like they were big beacons of sort of engagement and deployment of it. And the UK, we kind of I feel like we were very late to it, but then when we got to it, we kind of accelerated. But I would say for 10 years, we were almost nowhere in open source.
Don, back to skills. How has your career evolved here? What have you seen? And also maybe talk a little bit about chaos and the...
Yeah, so my journey into open source started when I was a Unix system administrator back in the 90s, and I worked for a manufacturing company. And it turns out manufacturing companies do not like to spend money on IT, so I used a whole bunch of open source software. And then a few years later, around 2000, I ended up working at Intel, and they needed somebody who knew something about Linux, and at the time it was very much a Microsoft place, and they looked at me and they were like, you did Unix, you at least know what open source is. So I started working more strategically on open source and looking at which, at the time, like developer tools, Linux operating systems, things like that were likely to be strategic for Intel over the long term, which things we should invest in. And that's when I got sold. So I started realizing that there's all this structure behind these open source projects. There's governance, there's community that allows these projects to not only function, but to produce really top quality software out of these what seem like amorphous communities from the outside. So I started getting more and more fascinated by it. And then I'll just fast forward a whole bunch of years to chaos, because one of the things that I've found so interesting about this particular open source project is we're focused on metrics. So how do you measure the health and sustainability of your open source projects? So for me, this was super interesting. So I've been working with the tools that later became the Chaos Project, I don't know, for a dozen years, I guess. And they were part of the tools that I used for my PhD when I did that on the Linux kernel. And I find that really interesting because I think it's really important for us to think strategically about the long-term sustainability of these open source projects that we rely on. We build our businesses on top of them. We build our livelihoods on top of them. And some of them have very few maintainers or, fundamental problems with the software itself. So working on the Chaos project has allowed me to sort of deep dive into some of these sustainability metrics and look more critically at some of our open source projects, and not just look critically at them, but where can we improve? How can we improve? And working on things like practitioner guides to help people understand how to improve the health and sustainability of these open source projects that we rely on.
Thanks, Dawn. And I think that's a really nice segue in, Rebecca. So tell us about these maintainers, these people creating free commits, creating free open source that all these companies sit on top of. What have you seen in your research?
So, yeah, it's going to join up very nicely with what Dawn's just said. So we did a study a few years ago, which we're still processing the data for, so apologies that it's not all fully worked through, but we interviewed, it was about open source developers' careers. So we were trying to understand how people do open source. Obviously, it's all going on in these communities, but who are these people? How are they doing it? And how are they managing that in relation to all the other things that they have to do, like earn money? And so we put together a sample. We used GitHub as our way in, and we tried to purposely sample for diversity. So we were really keen to understand how the more marginal groups within the industry were managing to their working lives and doing open source. So we had quite a few women in the sample, and we managed to include quite a few Global South developers. And we asked them to tell us all about how they do what they do, how they got there, their careers, and all the things they were juggling. And we heard about how they managed freelance work alongside open source work, how they did their open source work. All of that video absolutely captures large sections of what we found in that research, because it shows and we've come to this term ecosystem, which everyone has been using, but we were thinking about ecosystems in relation to individual workers and how they put together a kind of portfolio of different things, work that they love, which is often their open source work, and work that they have to do to earn money. And then they have to have families, and they have to manage all of that. So you see gender and those kind of issues coming through in how people manage their working lives. And what's interesting, all of the focus here, the live CV thing we saw in action in the way that people got jobs. They were headhunted through their GitHub profiles. They used their GitHub profiles to get work. But also, we have to see the way in which global tech companies, and most of them were working in global tech companies, were given a certain amount of freedom in those companies to have, there was flexibility. They worked a 4-day week, or they had various ways in which they were able to manage their working lives, which enabled them to carry on doing the open source contributions because they're spending their evenings and weekends or their non-working time, their non-employed time on that work. So the flexibility of companies was quite crucial, and the ability to do freelance work and to form a sort of ecosystem where the two forms of work that you're doing, the paid and the unpaid, are informing each other and allowing both of those to develop and to continue. Open source isn't going to be sustainable, and this is what drove the projects in the first place, this question about how you sustain open source projects, which are essentially often, not always, being managed and contributed, and the communities are being built by people who are not paid for that work.
And I think that's a really important point, in that people often misunderstand that when an individual contributes, even in the course of their employment, if they create something that then needs maintained, the burden of that travels with the individual, not the company. They are the maintainer. Yeah. So if they work for Red Hat one day and SUSE the next, that travels with them, not necessarily the company. And it's a heavy burden that, I think people should think twice before they commit something that is going to create a huge maintenance burden for them over time. And it's one of the things that we've really thought about when we've asked for support in building out the community in the UK to create more inclusion in the UK, is that some of those existing maintainers need help. And the more people we can bring in, the more help we can give. So this would be beneficial to open source globally, but it also, in our view, is going to create more of these people with these skills who are able to be hired across the planet Matt mentioned Mark Shuttleworth. I saw him last week, and I think Canonical is now, I think he said 1,200 employees. UK-based company, and 150 people are employed from the UK in it, 200 in the US. The other, let me do this, 850, have I got that right? The other 850 are employed across the globe. And when we worked there, we hired people at Canonical in 42 countries. We hired based on skills. And that piece, the hiring based on skills, is the potential that we open up by bringing more skilled individuals across the UK. And I want to come back to Don and Liz. So how do you see that value increasing? Yes.
I just wanted to
Yeah,
sort
sure.
of build a little bit on,
Yeah,
on what was
absolutely.
being said there, because I think it's important to recognise that there is this spectrum of people who are paid a salary to work on proprietary software and people who are not paid and are doing passion projects and in their free time and contributing to open source that way. But there's also a lot of people who are paid, you know, they're spending their paid time to contribute to open source, because a lot of companies have really, you know, the cloud native industry is full of companies who have recognised that, you know, they need to be maintaining open source projects and contributing to those projects in some ways to get the value from that technology. But I think there's a really important skill that people need to develop when they're working on open source around the ability to say no and the ability to push back on the kind of expectations that people build up. I had a really interesting conversation with a maintainer a few weeks ago where he was basically saying, you know, it's really hard because I've got, and he named, you know, a very, very successful bank. And he said, you know, and they're using my project. So, you know, I felt like I really need to do the work that they need. It's like, you've got a bank who have an urgent need for you to do work for them. They're basically asking you to ask them to build that. You know, don't just do it for free in your spare time. They see value in the work that you're doing.
Yeah.
And maintainers around the world need to be taught how to sort of recognise those signals.
And maybe that's part of the skills that we should also help with. So what we're looking at is how to engage champions across the UK to help individuals who have been taught to code make their first contributions and become more and more involved in community projects on the basis that we think it will achieve value for them, i.e. they will get a job and be paid to do that work. What we're not saying is that we're going to create this perpetual group of people in the UK who are going to contribute for free. Because today the money changes hands, and that's exactly what I'm asking you and Dawn about, is how have careers, yours and the people around you, evolved? How do the skills evolve? You see people in very well-paid jobs. They're all over the UK, they're all over other countries too, they're in rural areas. How does that evolve? How do those skills develop? And how do you see our plans of engaging people across the country really inputting into that?
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes down to that visibility that, you know, we talked about, and the fact that these open source communities, and that there are lots of different communities that build around different projects, a lot of them are actually very good at helping each other out. You know, words like mutuality that we'll use, you know, the meetup scene, the ability to find other people either online or in these kind of local groups and learn from each other. It's this whole sort of education system that's sort of in parallel to the official education system. But the fact that, you know, you can find out about something that you're excited by, that you're interested in, and you can go out and research it, and you can, I think somebody mentioned before, maybe it was on the video, you know, you can reach out to the person who built that project. You can probably find them on Twitter or LinkedIn or GitHub or wherever, and they're probably actually really flattered to be asked questions. You know I get questions. You know, people will reach out and you know, you think, oh, that's really nice that somebody from, you know, halfway around the globe has seen my work and asked me a question. I think that's really rewarding. But it provides this visibility, and I know if I'm looking for people with particular skills, the chances are that I will have met somebody who ticks the right boxes, either online or at a meetup, or I've seen them speaking, or, you know, I've come across their work somehow. And with that sort of flip side of recruiting people into our team at Isovalent, there is a pool of people that we can call on because we've seen their skills are there already, and we want to, that person's really talented and they have real expertise in the particular technology we're interested in. Let's reach out, let's have a conversation and see if, it can be a mutually beneficial outcome.
Yeah, and just to build on what Liz said, one of the most interesting things about open source is that you really do get to work with all of these people who work at so many different companies. And the people you get to meet are people that you can learn something new from them. You can, chat with them about what they're doing. People are generally very accessible. You can, do talks at conferences with these people. And so you really do get to know these people on a pretty deep level. And they get to know, in turn, the skills that you have, your strengths, maybe what you're not as good at. And then the next time you're looking for a job, it gets a lot easier because you can talk to some of these people that who work at companies where they enjoy the work and they get to work on open source technologies. And so I think the networking piece of this gets underestimated, I think, in a lot of cases. Honestly, every job I've ever had, with the exception of one job, I've gotten it based on the people that I knew, who knew the work that I did through open source. And in a lot of those cases, frankly, those people were in the US. And I got jobs where I could work from the UK because those people knew who I was, they knew the work that I'd done, and they knew my reputation in open source. And so I got jobs that otherwise, frankly, would have been based in the US. There was no reason for them to base it here in the UK, other than the fact that, for some reason of timing or whatever, I was a good fit for it. So I think that in a lot of cases, these relationships that people build in open source, they sort of span geographies, they span time, they span technologies.
Thanks. And Matt, when Will was talking about scaling businesses and all the challenges, you've looked at that for us as our entrepreneur in residence. Do you think this potential to build a bigger skilled workforce here in the UK could really help that?
Definitely. Yeah. But I think
Yes.
end of answer. But genuinely, I don't think we lack the talent or the knowledge in the UK. We're just not very good at kind of developing it, I think, from what I've seen. I spoke to a lot of new graduates or people who got into open source or the technology companies that are in the UK based on open source, and almost to a fault, every single one had got involved in it kind of by chance. Like we don't really have very good mechanisms of being able to get people into our space, and I think that's a real problem, honestly. And I think I picked up on what you were saying about the fact it's almost like a positive feedback loop. Once people start getting involved, it builds the visibility, and people get access to a network. They get recognized for their skills. They're more likely to get a job. And we haven't found a way, I don't think yet, to really operationalize that, if that's the right word. I did speak to someone at Google recently who was like, I saw the same problem. He was from Nigeria, and he took a load of training materials that had been built for some of the open source big software vendors. The one he actually used was MongoDB, which obviously I've got some experience with. And he decided to go and create a partnership with a friend in Nigeria, go to universities, and he just took existing training materials that were on the internet, that were well structured, that were for free, and he just got a lot of IT students in a room on a Saturday and started training them on it. And he said that the response was unbelievable. Like within a few weeks, people had created new applications, that had been offered jobs, that their confidence was growing. And I just think we haven't really done anything like that in the UK. And I just feel like there's an amazingly strong need for us to look at doing something like that. And again, I looked at all sorts of ideas to try and get young people engaged and involved in technology. I think a lot of people, like for me, it was the BBC Micro and sort of like when in the 80s and 90s. Nowadays, more it's like the Raspberry Pi.
You mean the 1980s? You just said the 1890s. You're 18 years worse than me.
You're not that old.
Yeah, and then now it's more the Raspberry Pi. But I went through all these like amazing ideas. What would it be like, you know, as a recent graduate, maybe to go and like see what it'd be like to create a small application that, you know, it's like an e-commerce shop, or what would it be like to sort of program a drone? And actually, the feedback I got was like, what does it take to just set up a Linux desktop and push my first commit to GitHub? That was literally the answer of what people wanted. So we can just do that, just make it very easy for people to do that. I just think we'd end up sort of exposing so much more talent and so many more opportunities than right now. They're all quite latent in the UK at the moment. Whereas I think in the US, I disagree. I mean, I listen to a lot of business podcasts. I read a lot of blog posts. They're always talking about open source, mainly in relation to AI at the moment. But you know, it's a big part of the conversation. It's not really part of the conversation, I don't think, in the UK.
And I think that's the disconnect that we reference in all of our reporting between the US and here, and the US almost in the rest of the world apart from China. Where you look across Europe, there is talk of open source, but not at the scale that there is in the US. And when you know, I had a conversation maybe 3 years ago with a founder who said to me, you simply would not build a business in tech in the US not built on open source anymore. You just wouldn't do it. It's a different world.
Yeah, and I'm sad to say that like a lot of the people that were starting businesses at the same time I was in the UK 10 years ago, I don't see the same opportunity to do it in the UK anymore, and are moving to the US to do it because we're a bit locked out of the EU market now. You know, we've seen a move like and centres create around Berlin and Paris. I think that's a problem. Although in some ways maybe it's an opportunity for people, because in the same way our businesses are undervalued, I think our tech talent is also undervalued. So I see the UK as being actually a very good place to find good tech talent. It's maybe slightly cheaper than it is in the US. So you could probably scale a business in the UK, but actually use UK as the engine for the engineering and the innovation and the invention.
And it's really one of the things that drove this project, this community inclusion project as a way to build skills and build jobs, was the conference that we had 2 years ago, our first State of OpenCon, and we gave away 100 tickets to students, and many of those came from code schools. And the consistent message, you were the first to come back and say this to me, but the consistent message from those students was that they'd been taught to code, that they didn't know how to contribute to open source, and they just needed that story that you gave there with the guy from Nigeria, somebody to bring them into a room and engage them to take that step and bring them into this potential and to open up that potential of the living CV for them. Yeah. Rebecca, anything else you want to add about that living CV and perhaps us engaging more people?
What fascinated me, just a little anecdote from the research, was that we managed to recruit several Global South from Nigeria, in fact. And what was fascinating was that they had set up in Lagos, they had set up a community that worked together locally. Although they were contributing to an open source project, they were doing it in a local way. They were supported, they had set up the tech so that anyone could join. The barriers to entry were very, very low. And that had generated this huge community in Nigeria that were of young people all doing open source, working on projects, talking to each other, contributing. And I thought, God, I haven't seen that in the UK. That's happening in the Global South, that kind of mobilisation, but not in the UK.
And I should say, it wasn't Google funded or organised. It was an individual who works for Google that did it by himself. Like that's what was kind of cool about it. It wasn't some sort of highfalutin top-down thing. It was a grassroots effort that we just haven't yet created.
And I think the way that we plan to take this forward, and we're looking for the government to invest in, is in a structured way where we pool together that community that way back when we started this afternoon, and Jen was showing you the stats about the UK, we will pool together that contributor community in the UK who span from Barry in Wales to Shetland and Scotland, and we will engage with them and help them to engage with people local to their communities. And we will find the projects that people get employed in, and we will help them to contribute to those projects to build future careers for them. The data that Jen showed you has been updated in only 6 months around skills. We will do a full skills report in November, but OpenUK is now taking data every 3 months to crunch that data and see how contribution in the UK is being made, where it's being made from, who's making it, what they're making it to, what companies are employing people, and analysing that in a depth that no other country is doing. And we will then track, as we build this project out, the people who become involved in it, everybody who's touched by this project, and the breadth of contribution that we're able to build. So I'm going to bring the sort of section on contribution to an end, but I want to thank the four of you for joining us on the stage. Thank you.
Thank you.